My name is Don Hayden. I'm one of the co-hosts of today's conference with Mr. O'Naughton. And we're going to start the afternoon session. It's my privilege to recognize King & Spalding, our platinum sponsor, and also introduce our own Harry Burnett, who is the director of MEIS and a partner at King & Spalding. Harry?
Thanks, Don. Hi, everybody. See what 10 grand gets you? We're really lucky today to have a keynote speaker, Alexis Mourre, and he's going to give an address, and then we'll be interviewed by Carolyn, Lamm, who I think is familiar to everyone in this room. I'll just say a few words. First of all, we're extremely lucky to have both of you. Alexis has served as counsel, president, and tribunal co-arbitrator, sole arbitrator, or expert in more than 270 international arbitrations, both ad hoc and before most international arbitration institutions. He established his own arbitration practice in May 2015 after having founded Castaldi, Mourre & Partners in 1996. Alexis has been a court member of the ICC Court, International Court of Arbitration, for 12 years, first as vice president from 2009 to 2015, and then as president from July 1st, 2015 until June 30, 2021. He was vice president of the ICC Institute of World Business Law from 2011 to 2015 and has formerly served as co-chair of the IBA Arbitration Committee from 2012 to 2013, LCIA court member, council member of the Milan International Chamber of Arbitration. He's author of numerous books and publications in the field of international arbitration and international business law, private international law, and arbitration law. He's the founder and former editor of the Paris Journal of International Arbitration. He's also the founder and former president of the Paris, the home of international arbitration. He's fluent in French, English, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. So please, everyone, welcome Alexis.
Well, Harry, thank you very much for these kind words. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank, of course, MEIS for the kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in Miami, but it's a special pleasure to be here with you today. And I will try to share some thoughts on where we are today with ISDS. And we may be strong defenders of investment arbitration, or we may think that it should be reformed, or we may believe that it is profoundly evil and needs to be dismantled. But what we can all agree on is that the current ISDS framework, as it has been built in the past 40 years on a net of almost now 3,000 bilateral and multilateral treaties, is in a profound crisis. And it is in crisis because us, the defenders of the idea that investments should be protected by a rule of law-based system, allowing access to a fair and just dispute resolution mechanism, we have been politically defeated. We have lost the battle of public opinion. We have, to a large extent, lost the battle of legitimacy. And I would like to reflect with you today on why this is so. Why have we, the international law specialists, the investment law and arbitration specialists, those who know better, why have we lost the battle of legitimacy on investor-state arbitration? I will not address today who is right and who is wrong in the arbitration debate, whether ACMEA is legally correct or not, and whether the demise of investor-state arbitration will result or not in less investments or in less advantageous investments or ultimately in less prosperity. let us assume for a moment that we, the arbitration specialists, are right, or let's say technically right. Let's assume for a moment that the system as we know it today is the best possible one and the only one able to provide a meaningful protection to international investments. The question is, why have we failed in having that truth understood and accepted by the wider community? And in order to answer that question, I submit that we need to understand better who our opponents are, where they come from, how they think, and how they operate. And when I refer to our opponents, I do not refer to the European Union or to the many states, albeit not all of them, having expressed their desire to exit the system as it is, but I rather refer to the civil society, or more exactly, to those who pretend to represent the civil society against the current ISDS framework. When we look at the debate on investment arbitration as it has unfolded in the past 10 or 15 years, the most striking thing is a complete misunderstanding between both sides. There could not be a better example of two ships passing in the night. Different values, different languages, different cultures, but above all, no desire to bridge the differences and no desire to reach a compromise. To us, the existing system, based as it is on a direct right to arbitrate under rules that are brought from international commercial arbitration rules, for us, this is existential. Like Marxists, who think that communism is the result of a necessary and inevitable historical evolution, we think that investor-state arbitration is the ultimate evolution of the international protection of the right of aliens after gunboat diplomacy and diplomatic protection. And our belief is based on the deep conviction that the free flow of investments is good, that it is good for societies, that it is good for prosperity. And we assume, even if that has never been demonstrated scientifically, we assume that investor-state arbitration has the effect of increasing investment flows. And the consequence is that the power of sovereigns, the power of states to regulate their economies must be limited. It must be limited in order to protect private property and to enforce the principle pacta sunt servanda, a principle as old as Western civilization itself, a principle that goes back to the old Roman law. And this is the very raison d'etre of investment arbitration. Our opponents, however, think the exact contrary. They think that investor-state arbitration is nothing more than a post-colonial instrument of domination by the powerful against the democratic will of peoples, as that will is expressed through their legitimate governments. They think that investor-state arbitration establishes an unacceptable discrimination between nationals and aliens. And they think that it allows multinationals to blackmail governments to the detriment of the poor. And they think that it leads to promoting polluting industries in contradiction with environmental public commitments. For us, the system needs to be maintained, hence our complete and forceful rejection of ACMEA. But for them, it needs to be dismantled, hence their rejection not only of direct access to arbitration, but also of any proposal, such as the EU Multilateral Investment Court, that would maintain in favor of foreigners' rights that are not enjoyed by nationals. And the second striking difference between the two camps is about words. It is about words, about language, and about audiences. They speak the language of emotions and politics, and we speak the cold and rational language of legal technique. They speak to the broader public, and we speak to ourselves, the insiders. We defend ISDS with correct technical arguments on the shortcomings of diplomatic protection, the neutrality of the arbitration process, and the ability of arbitrators to address complex matters requiring time and experience. But they instead agitate simple messages, which may well distort the reality, but loudly speak to the public and resonate with the deep concerns and fears of societies that are torn by a profound aspiration to more state, more protection, less openness, less globalization, and less free markets. And that is the root cause of our ideological defeat. It is not the result of a plot by the European Commission to dismantle international law. And it is not the result of a plot by the European Commission to arrogate to itself exorbitant powers. It is the result of a profound change in our societies and in the way in which public opinions perceive and see the relationship between the state and the economy. All this might be history now, and the train, unfortunately, the train has long left the station. But if understanding the history has any interest, I submit that we need to look at the beginning of that history. And the beginning of that history was really 25 years ago, and it was the rise and demise of the multilateral agreement on investments, called the MAI. And the MAI was an OECD initiative, which aim was to adopt a multilateral framework for investment protection, including fair and equitable treatment and protection against expropriation and direct access to arbitration in favor of qualified investors. Negotiations started in 1995. They were not transparent. There was no announcement, and the negotiating papers were not published. Everything was done behind closed doors in Paris, at the Château de la Muette, and Château de la Muette in French means the mute castle, and the mute castle for that occasion bore its name very well. And for 2 years, no one noticed. And no one noticed until when, in February of 1997, an American NGO founded by consumer advocate Ralph Nader, that NGO was called Public Citizen, leaked a draft of the agreement to the internet. And that happened in 1997. 1997 was a very special point in time. With the fall of the Wall of Berlin, the old 20th century ideologies were dying. Old ideologies were gone. Communism, as much as Chicago School inspired liberalism. But the nature and form of political activism, in particular left-wing activism, was also undergoing profound changes. The traditional far-left political organizations, Trotskyist or Maoist as they were disappearing, or they were becoming irrelevant. As their militants, thousands of experienced, talented, and cultivated activists were flowing to new forms of action through a new generation of organizations. These were no longer political parties in the traditional sense, but less ideological and more pragmatic organizations, each focused on a particular purpose. This was the time of the rise of humanitarian law, as well of the environmental activism in the aftermath of the Kyoto Protocol, 1997. And the focus of these new militants, these NGO militants, this focus was no longer on, as it has been in the 60s, on a global vision of the world. It was no longer a revolutionary aspiration to a complete change of society. It was rather achieving immediate and concrete results on practical issues such as human rights, environment, consumer protection, or taxation. The scope of each of these NGOs was different, but they all converged on a common foe, globalization and liberalism, and nothing better than investment arbitration can epitomize the evils of globalization and liberalism. I read in the last ICA Congress series, I read an article, an excellent article by Jan Paulsen on Barcelona Attraction. You may have read it. And at some point in his article on Barcelona Attraction, I don't know why, but Jan refers at some point to Frantz Fanon's famous book, Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth. And Jan says this, and I quote him. He says, "Neocolonialism, Fanon might say today, is not the fruit of foreign investments or the imposition of international norms protecting them, but of modern forms of dependence on what used to be known as the metropolitan powers." And with all due respect to Jan, I do not think that Frantz Fanon, the friend of Jean-Paul Sartre and François Maspero, the anti-capitalist activist, the active militant of the Algerian National Liberation Front, would ever have said that. And to suggest that a radical anti-colonialist militant and leftist activist such as Fanon might in some way have supported the idea of investment protection shows how blinded we are by our belief in the righteousness of our technical case in favor of arbitration and investment protection. The other remarkable change that characterized the end of the last century was, of course, the spectacular rise of internet and the social networks, not only as simple means of communication, but also as powerful political platforms. So in that context, the Ralph Nader public citizen leakage of the MAI fell on very, very fertile ground. And in fact, in a matter of months, 600 NGOs from 70 different countries mobilized and started a violent campaign against the treaty. By the end of 1997, these hundreds of NGOs had coordinated adopting in Ljubljana the Stop MAI manifesto, which was in turn widely published and disseminated. The American activist Lori Wallach, whom you may know, who would later lead the campaign against the TTP, Lori Wallach then jokingly said that the treaty was like Dracula. It was like Dracula because it would die as soon as it would see the light of the day. Unfortunately, she was right. I remember well how things then unfolded in France. It started, as it often does in France, with the cinema industry. Employees and actors mobilized and spread the message that the MAI would put an end to the French so-called cultural exception, l'exception culturelle, by preventing the government from subsidizing the industry. Associations representing the industry then wrote to socialist and green members of parliament, and these MPs in turn started questioning the government. An NGO called ATTAC, the Association for the Taxation of Financial Transactions, followed suit, joined by trade unions as well by environmental and civil rights associations. The matter then snowballed to become of national interest. Who were these unknown people who were, unbeknownst to everybody, plotting to dismantle the most cherished social protections and to grant exorbitant rights to foreign multinationals? This marked the first time, 10 years before the Tapie case, it marked the first time when the general public discovered what arbitration is, or at least what they thought it to be. And it was not for the best. The opponents to the treaty not only attacked the lack of transparency of the negotiation process and the lack of consultation of the civil society, but also the absence in the negotiation agenda of any reference to labor and environmental standards. The pressure becomes such that even the OECD Trade Union Advisory Council had to disavow the treaty. And in April, the French socialist government, led by Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, announced the suspension of the negotiations and entrusted Minister Catherine Lalumière to provide a report on the matter. 4 other states, the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada, followed suit and also instituted parliamentary reviews of the MAI. By then, the greatest financial panic since 1929 had overwhelmed global markets, unfolding a global economic crisis that led many countries to impose capital controls and tighter regulations of financial flows. With the 1998 crisis came in the working and the middle class a growing fear of impoverishment and social downgrading. Workers started for the first time to think that their children would not enjoy the same standards of living as they and their fathers had. And this became even worse with the 2008 financial crisis. Poor people were now paying the price, the very high price, for a purportedly law-based economic framework that had proven completely unable to protect them. The consequence of the total impunity of the financial sector had enjoyed nourished distrust toward the private sector, towards globalization, and towards free markets. And year later, the youth would also start to be deeply anguished, this time by global warming and the idea that our liberal societies are leading humanity to a catastrophe. This was a society marked by fear, with a fast-growing aspiration to the restoration of state powers across the world. And in that context, the MAI initiative, of course, had become politically undefensible. And in October of 1998, the French government withdrew from the negotiations, which in fact killed the treaty. The report of Minister Catherine Lalumière, which had been delivered by the government a month before, including the following interesting note, and I quote her, I quote the report. The report says, in spite of the highly technical nature of the topic, the representatives of the civil society that we heard were perfectly informed and able to perfectly articulate their criticism. The arguments against the MAI are now consistently formulated across the various OECD countries, and the opposition to the treaty went much beyond sectorial or technical points to express a broader and more fundamental concern. And this note of Minister Lalumière reflects a reality that remains true today, and it is the high level of coordination between the NGOs opposing ISDS, intensely using internet and social networks to disseminate a simple and easily understandable message. As the well-known leader of one of these groups once said to the press, and I quote him, "If a negotiator says something to someone over a glass of wine, we'll have it on the internet within an hour all over the world." And that's what happened. The constellation of these NGOs is extremely diverse. There are labor organizations such as the AFL-CIO in the US. There are international labor federations. There are political parties, essentially from the left part of the political spectrum, but also now from the right with the growing force of populism and nationalism. But not only them. One of the most striking things that we are today witnessing in Europe is that even center-right parties with an established governmental tradition, even them have joined the anti-ISDS chorus. In fact, there is virtually no longer anyone across the European political spectrum defending ISDS. There are environmental associations such as Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth, an organization which has branches in 65 countries. There are human rights associations such as Amnesty International, citizens watchdog groups, universities, student associations, and even churches. And there are also no global associations like ATTAC, which militate for more capital controls, taxation, and regulation. And how did we, the arbitration and business community, confront with that opposition? We did that in the easiest and possibly wrongest manner, by denying these organizations representativity and entitlement to have a say on matters of trade policy and investment protection. This is exactly what the ICC has done in the final declaration of its September 1998 Geneva Business Dialogue, which was signed by 450 international corporate leaders. And I would like to quote this ICC declaration. It says this: ICC recognizes how societies are changing, with citizens speaking up and expressing their deep-felt concerns. However, in some respects, the emergence of activist pressure groups risk weakening the effectiveness of public rules, legitimate institutions, and democratic processes. These organizations should place emphasis on legitimizing themselves, improving their internal democracy, transparency, and accountability. They should assume full responsibility for the consequences of their activities. Where this does not take place, rules establishing their rights and responsibilities should be considered. Business is accustomed to working with trade unions, consumer organizations, and other representative groups that are responsible, credible, transparent, and accountable, and consequently command respect. What we question is the proliferation of activist groups that do not accept these self-disciplinary criteria. This incredibly patronizing statement, which was drafted by the then Secretary General of the ICC, Maria Katawi, is extremely interesting. It is interesting because it shows a profound ignorance and misunderstanding of the reality of the social movement, and also because it expresses the old world vision where multilateral organizations and business organizations were accustomed to have structured discussions with identified accredited organizations such as trade unions whose legitimacy was accepted. Our modern world, however, is very different. We are no longer in a dialogue between accredited institutions representing vested interests, but in a diffuse confrontation at the global level involving an amorphous and fast-evolving constellation of interconnected organizations. And this cloud of organizations conveys one single message, which has permeated the thinking of the most institutional settings, as shown by the recently published report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights that was published on GAR some days ago. The events would show how misconceived the ICC 1998 position was. In 2014, ATTAC launched a petition against TTP/IP and CETA, and that petition in less than 1 year had collected more than 3.3 million signatures across Europe. That initiative and the surrounding political criticism of ISDS prompted the European Commission to launch, some months later, an online consultation on the TTIP, in the context of which it received 150,000 responses, 97 of which rejected ISDS. And of course, this raises a fundamental question of legitimacy. Why should the voice of an NGO or even of a single individual deciding to answer a survey have more weight than that of a company leader who will not care to participate? Is the value of that kind of public consultation not distorted by the activism of NGOs calling their members to participate while pro-arbitration technicians and the broader public will not? And that may be true. Still, while the individual representativity of certain NGOs may be questioned, what cannot be overlooked is their number, their determination, and their enormous capacity to organize and defend their ideas, as right or wrong as they may be. Collectively, with the power of internet and social networks, these organizations have become a powerful expression of the global public opinion that no state can afford to ignore. Of course, TTP/IP primarily died as a consequence of the Trump election. But the more fundamental root cause was the 1998 and 2008 crisis and the complete change in the public opinion that ensued. The demise of TTP/IP was the starting point of a long series of setbacks for ISDS until ACMEA in 2018, the end of European BITs, and the announced intention of the EU to withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty. So is the EU right? Is it wrong? Any one of us can have its own views on that. But does it really matter now? What ultimately matters today is a simple reality. And that reality is, at least in Europe, that it has become politically impossible to obtain in 27 different national parliaments the ratification of any treaty that has the simple word arbitration in it. And this is why, right or wrong, the EU has decided that in order to pursue its trade policy, and Cecilia Malmström trade policy is indeed a very ambitious one, in order to pursue that trade policy, it just needed to get rid of arbitration. And that's what they are doing. So where do we go from there? According to UNCTAD, there were 569 terminations of BITs between 1999 and 2022, 70% of which occurred during the last decade. In 2022 alone, UNCTAD recorded 84 terminations compared with 15 new treaties signed. Of course, treaties including a direct right to arbitration will continue to exist. All generation treaties will coexist for decades, with new generation treaties providing for narrower standards and limiting the right to arbitrate, and also with treaties including mechanisms along the line of the EU Investment Court and with treaties with no dispute resolution mechanism at all in favor of investors. And of course, this raises a problem of fragmentation, but the problem is not only the problem of fragmentation. The problem is, of course, that the EU proposed investment court is likely to be dysfunctional for many reasons that are not part of my speech today, and that in many of the new generation treaties that may retain arbitration, there will be less protection afforded to investors. Many unavoidable features of treaty-based offers to arbitrate will continue to suscitate strong political opposition, no matter what. If anything, because by their very nature, BITs only contain obligations on states, which fits the idea of an unbalanced advantage, and also because of concerns on multiple actions, risks of double recovery, and impairment of the state's right to regulate for the public good. So it does not require much wisdom to predict that the more reforms are introduced in the system in order to make treaties more acceptable to the public, and the less there will be protective of investments. Can something be done about that? Well, yes, at least one thing, apart from the many proposals for reform of the treaty-based system, but one thing can be done. And that thing is perhaps returning to the contractual protection of investment. These backdrops, all the backdrops that I just mentioned, can be eliminated in a bilateral contractual setting. And in this regard, an important initiative has just been taken by the ICC and UNIDROIT, led by our friends Eduardo Silva Romero for the ICC Institute and by Professor Maria Chiara Malaguti, president of the UNIDROIT, to prepare a model contract for international investments. And this is an important initiative. It's an important initiative which aims at the adoption of a new legal instrument by 2026. And it is an initiative which has the potential of offering a valid alternative to investors where there is no longer an offer to arbitrate or where the applicable treaties have become too restrictive. A contract may, of course, provide for arbitration under the exit rules or the UNCIT rule or the ICC rules. It may eliminate the sensitivities concerning the limitation to the state regulatory powers, as there is an individual negotiations on stabilization commitments. The eligible investors are defined on a case-by-case basis in the contract, thus eliminating any concern as to use standing, parallel actions, and double recovery. Contractual protection avoids the difficulties arising from the distinction between contract claims and treaty claims, as well as from umbrella clauses, in particular when applied on the basis of an MFN clause. And it is also easy to introduce obligations in a contract on the part of the investor as a counterparty of the advantages that it receives, allowing to address environmental concerns, but also health and labor commitments. This project will face a number of interesting challenges. First, how to adapt the old traditional stabilization clauses to today's reality by balancing the obligation not to apply new legislation with legitimate regulatory objectives, which may in turn imply to balance stabilization with obligations to negotiate compensations in good faith. Another interesting and important challenge is to assess how to contractualize international law concepts and standards such as legitimate expectations and FET in light of the state's right to issue general regulation in the public interest. And the question of the law applicable to this contract will also be interesting. Should it be international law, as it wants to be, or for many investment contracts, or should it be the unit right principles, which have useful provisions on matters such as force majeure and hardship, and which are already tested in investment contracts? Of course, one may object that contractual protection is only available to investors having sufficient bargaining power, sufficient negotiating power to secure bespoke arrangements. But the models such as the one proposed by the ICC, or that may be proposed by the ICC, and UNIDROIT will precisely assist in making it accessible to smaller players. And more generally, if such an instrument can find the right answer to these questions, it will become an interesting alternative to the faltering framework of treaty-based investment protection. Establishing a framework for the contractual protection of investments will surely assist in making sure that investments will continue flowing with confidence in the rule of law and adjudication by arbitration, but it will perhaps also assist in putting an end to an increasingly bitter debate which we are losing and which ultimately risks endangering international commercial arbitration as much as investment arbitration. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to say a few words about our interviewer of Alexis, which you'll understand is a great treat for myself and everyone here. Carolyn Lamm is a senior partner at White & Case. She's a distinguished faculty chair at the University of Miami School of Law in the White & Case LLM program in international arbitration, where she teaches international investment arbitration. She's also a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers, which is an incredible accomplishment. It's the preeminent organization of trial lawyers in North America, dedicated to the highest standards of trial advocacy, professionalism, and the administration of justice. And these are just little tidbits out of a CV that we could, be here reading all of your accolades for several hours. That I'll add with Law 360 named Carolyn one of the 5 most influential female international arbitrators.
Thank you so much, but most of all, thank you to Alexis for just a very thought-provoking discussion of the question of legitimacy of ISDS. Is that better? It was getting screechy. And we all acknowledge there, and as you did, 2,500 existing at least agreements, bilateral, multilateral agreements. I think, though, the capital importing states, I don't know that they're going to do much to walk away from the ability to do whatever is needed to enhance and facilitate investment into their jurisdictions. And investors clearly demand protection. I appreciate the question of the agreement. The big investors will find a way to get the protections they need, but is it really the answer to the legitimacy concerns? Is that on?
Yeah. Okay, that's a big question. Thank you, Carolyn. Well, I would say two things on this. The first is that, again, the criticism against ISDS may be right, it may be wrong. My point today was not to enter into a discussion on this. And of course, we are right on many of the points that we articulate in favor of BITs and treaty-based offers to arbitrate. But this is not the point. The point is that we have to acknowledge that this system, at least in the West, has become unacceptable and it is rejected. Like it or not, this is the reality, and there are much broader considerations behind that, which go much beyond arbitration and much beyond what we might think about the virtues of arbitration. And I think that one thing that, of course, feeds the public opposition is embedded in the very nature of treaty-based offers to arbitrate. And it is the fact that, first of all, there is an offer that is made to an open-ended category of beneficiaries, which at times is not defined with precision, but that the obligations are on the part of the state and not on the part of the investor. And that, as much as you can introduce counterbalancing clauses in treaties, I think will remain the case for a long time to come. But the broader consideration that I think we should make is this. We are not going to see ISDS disappear. It will remain. It will remain in a much more fragmented world. It will remain in a context where there will be different realities. But the question is, can ISDS really afford to lose Europe and the United States? We have seen, of course, after TTP was gone, we have seen the comprehensive and progressive TTP signed without the United States. There is arbitration there, but the United States are not there. Africa is now embarking in an important project, which is the African FTA, where there may be arbitration. I understand that they are meeting in these days in Egypt, and we don't know. One of the projects provides for arbitration, so there may be arbitration there. On the comprehensive progressive TTP, the US is not there, but China wants to get there. So what do we want as a global system? Do we want a system which is orientated and dominated by countries which values our values of democracy, openness, the rule of law, or do we want something else? That's the question. And the question is, can ISDS as we know it today really live in a fragmented world where Europe and the US will no longer be there? That I think is a big question, and we need to reflect on this.
Well, I agree that we do need to reflect on it. If we look at what led to the demise, the context of the demise of the negotiation for the multilateral investment agreement, there were really a convergence of political, policy, social, and economic debates. And I'm wondering, in today's world, do you even have the coherence of views? I think there's a real north-south split, east-west split, you know, the capital importing versus the capital exporting. Are we going to be able to come to an agreement that will suit everybody? Because the agreement that suits the capital exporting states, the US and Europe, may not have any interest on the part of the others in terms of the guarantees.
Well, if we look at what happens now to the WTO, we have part of the answer. The WTO is at a deep crisis. and it is in deep crisis because the very idea of a global multilateral framework for trade, I think, is gone. We have to accept that. I don't see why we should be able to frame a multilateral global framework for investment protection when commerce, which is a much more important matter, is not able to do so. We will have perhaps regional integration. What we may see in Africa is important, and we'll have to look at it. But I think that certain things can be done, perhaps to improve the system as it is. One question, for example, that is of deep concern to states is the inconsistency and contradiction between decisions. We have at Exit the system of ad hoc committees. Is that good? Should we not think of replacing this by some sort of a standing appeals body, which would hear all appeals against exit awards? That may be a good idea or not, but it may offer at least a partial answer to a question that is objectively unacceptable for states, that they receive inconsistent, contradictory awards on the basis of the same treaty and at times on the basis of the same investment. Another thing that we may want to think about, and this I mentioned Jan Paulson in my lecture, and I also remember this discussion that has unfolded on the appointment of arbitrators and the proposal that Albert Jan van den Berg put forward. And I have my doubts on this proposal in the context of commercial arbitration. But there might be a case for it in the context of investment arbitration. Perhaps if Exit were to appoint all arbitrators, that would take away one part of the criticism. Unfair criticism, certainly. Very unfair criticism, but it's there. And perhaps that would be a way of improving things.
Well, and that was a long answer. There are a lot of criticisms. I don't know that all of them find a real legitimacy crisis. I'm not sure parties would be terribly happy with being deprived of the ability to appoint arbitrators. They may not go to a system that requires such a thing. States, on the other hand, they enter into whatever bilateral agreements they want to enter into under the existing system. And there are many bilateral treaties that don't offer FET. They may have an ex-pro provision and no FET provision. States can do what they want and put the limitations they want under the existing system. It's exceedingly difficult to contemplate how either parties or states would benefit from complete uniformity. And I don't see how they're going to come to agree to complete uniformity. On the investment agreement that is under discussion, shall we say, would it be something that each state and each party could negotiate the provisions of, or? You
mean the ICC Unidroit project?
Yes.
Well, I think yes. The idea, to just say a word on the first part of your question. I mean, of course, you're right. I mean, treaties negotiate what they want, and treaties provide what is the outcome of negotiation between states. But again, if we look at the broader context, we see that this system has big problems, and I think we are, at least in Europe, heading to a violent end story for these treaties, particularly for the ECT and the European, intra-European at least, BITs. So the contract, the investment contract, is it negotiated by states? Of course, that's the very idea, is that it is negotiated individually between the state, the receptor state, and the investor. And I think that this would take away the main criticism that is currently unfolding against ISDS. And that criticism is the fact that we are protecting a broad category of investors that are able to exercise pressure on the state to curtail their regulatory power. If it's made on a bilateral individual basis, that criticism goes away. Now, I think the virtue of this project that the ICC and NIDROAT are launching is that and if they manage to, and that's not easy, if they manage to arrive at a good model contract, it will offer a basis not only to large companies, to large investors who have the resources to negotiate their investment contract anyway, but it will also offer a basis for less powerful investors. And I'm not saying that this is a complete answer to everything. There might not be one, but it's part of the answer.
Have states in Europe indicated at all that they would be willing to accept that approach instead of the treaty approach?
Not that I know, but this is at this very beginning.
Right.
And we have a lot to do in terms of preaching the gospel of investment protection in a different way, and that might be one way of preaching it in a less defensive way, more positive way, and in a way which may be more acceptable to states.
And given all of the debate that's going on, has a multilateral approach really been the approach that would be acceptable as the most promising vehicle, or do the states each and the investors like to maintain more control?
Well, I think if you mean by multilateral a global approach on the MAI style, I mean this I think is gone. This will never happen again. That's for sure. Now that states prefer to maintain control in the bilateral context, that may be the case. There are virtues, and we see more and more FTAs which are multilateral, but on a more regional basis, and that is a trend as well. But a multilateral agreement of the kind of the MAI, we will, I think, never see it again.
I appreciate that the NGOs have been very vocal and have learned how to work the system, so to speak. They still aren't the investors, nor are they the states. And while, of course, some of the message must be considered, how can they impair the states continuing who wish to continue with the existing system?
In a very simple way, by impacting, as they do, on the public opinion in a very powerful way. I mean, when an NGO like Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace says something, I mean, that NGO may not be representative of anything beyond its members, but it is perceived as having much broader legitimacy than we who speak in favor of investment protection. Because they speak on behalf, and whether they're entitled to do so or not is a complete different question. But they purport to speak on behalf of interests which are perceived to be much, much superior to those of investment protection, environment, human rights. And also the context that we are living of a crisis of our liberal societies, liberal economies are in crisis. We are going to see, like it or not, much, much more state interventionism. We see that in the context of state aid. We see that in the context of competition. We see that in the context of trade. That is provoking the crisis of the WTO, and WTO may never recover from that. This is the reality, and investment is not insulated from that.
No, but many of the new treaties, indeed, I think most of the new treaties that have been negotiated now do include labor, now do include protections for the environment, now do include human rights issues, so that I think they've had an impact within the system. So if the real question is a lot of noise that may not be rightly placed, and there's been some response, should the states, should investor organization, various chambers of commerce have already done it, should they be more vocal in defending the system and, of course, accepting change that's needed instead of an entire revamping of the system.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The question is whether they want to do it, whether there is a political will of doing it. And if you take what happened with the EU, it's to me, it's very enlightening. I mean, the EU has a very, very ambitious commercial agenda. They want to sign treaties. And in fact, the EU has never signed as many trade and commercial treaties as now. But they don't want to be bothered with NGOs, with hundreds of NGOs, making the siege of parliaments, because they understand, or they believe, right or wrong, that it's not possible today, as soon as you have arbitration and treaty, to get approval by parliaments. So that's real politics. They've decided, okay, let's get rid of arbitration and pursue what we believe to be much more important goals, which is to sign a lot of commercial treaties. That's the reality.
Get rid of arbitration for what? Are they suggesting you go to national courts at the place of the investment?
Well, that's interesting, because you see now FTAs with no dispute resolution clause at all. So that means that you're going to national court. No one's putting $1 billion. But I agree with you. I'm not saying that this is good for investment protection. This is not good for investment protection. But the underlying thinking, and again, it would deserve to be tested scientifically and not with slogans. The underlying thinking is that the opening of trade flows, that trade protection matters more than investment protection. So we want to sign treaties. We accept the inconvenience of having less protection for investments if we can get to signing more commercial treaties. That I think is the fundamental underlying thinking of the European Commission. So, right or wrong, again, every one of us might have its own views.
I understand the argument, but I struggle with the thought of going into a boardroom to say, yeah, we'll put $1 billion in Tajikistan, and we have no treaty protection. We'll be going to the Tajik courts if we've got a problem. That's not going to...
That may be right. Still, you have investments flowing to Brazil. Brazil has no investment protection, as you know. Tajikistan is a different reality. If you want to invest $1 billion in Tajikistan, perhaps if you're big enough to spend $1 billion in Tajikistan, you're big enough to negotiate a nice investment contract. France or any European country is a different reality. And again, we are going to see different answers to different realities across the world.
I think, though, Brazil is a good example. While they don't have investment treaties, they do have a very robust Brazilian arbitration system. So you would be able to, no matter what your size, agree to use a good system other than going to...
If you have a contract.
If you have a contract, or, I mean, no one's going in without a contract. No one's, So there are many of these issues that are really influenced significantly by national policies and the way particular states approach particular things. And I think as a result, certainly we've seen in the bilateral investment treaties, maybe not some of the earlier ones, but the later generations, really address things from a given state's perspective. And I'm wondering how, in your view, would one multilateral contract protect those national interests, or would there be a lot of variation?
A bilateral contract, you mean?
Yeah, the contract that the ICC is considering. Right. Yeah.
Well, that I don't know, because again, they are just starting. I suppose one of the challenges there is I mean, these contracts will have to be based on two things. I mean, the first would be a revival of stabilization clauses, and this should be seen how these clauses can be adapted to the realities of today. And the other big challenge, I suppose, will be how to contractualize standards that have been elaborated under international law by investment tribunals, such as FET. So how do you bring that into a contractual context? Now, the answer to that question, I don't know. I think that it should be feasible. It's a question of thinking of how can a contractual agreement between an identified investor and the state encapsulate commitments by the state to grant certain standards of treatment to the investor. On the other side, you will need to have in these contracts a number of commitments on the part of the investor that balance this protection that is afforded to the investor. But I'm convinced that in a contractual setting, you would take away most of the political opposition to the system, because the system is framed as a system, and that's what creates the opposition.
I'm not sure I agree that it's really correct that it's an entire system, because given the huge local and other national variances. But putting that aside, is the result of the backlash against ISDS really the result of a number of political trends and that, you know, are emerging with very diverse opinions?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's fundamentally the result. I mean, it's a result of fundamental change in our societies. If you look at our societies, sorry, in the 90s, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the beginning of the 2000s, in society these are societies that came from 30 years of development of free economies. And then you have a complete change. You have the rise of fears emerging from the 1998 crisis to the 2008 crisis. You have a feeling in societies that liberalism is not enough. Liberalism does no longer protect our societies, and that's true in particular in Europe and the United States, in the most established and old democracies. And you may see next year in the United States things that some of us at least will not like. In France, we may have Marine Le Pen getting elected at some point in some years from now. This will be a complete change. I think that our society, our world, will see in the 5 to 10 years to come changes as it has never seen since the Second World War.
That's entirely possible, but what kind of a reform agenda could address those concerns and still keep investment flows protected?
There are a number of answers. I mean, contractual protection is one answer. Improving the treaty-based investment protection is another one. And when I say, for example, ICSID is a system of ad hoc committees a good one? Should we not have a standing appellate body at ICSID? It's a question. The question of appointments of arbitrators. Of course, it's very good to be appointed. You are appointed, I'm appointed, we're happy to be appointed. We think it's good, and it's good, but it's not perceived as such. So perhaps if we put an end to this in the context of ICSID arbitration, investment arbitration, perhaps we also take away one, which is the most violent one, by the way, a part of the criticism.
You know, I think a proposal such as an appellate body at ICSID instead of an ad hoc committee approach is interesting, and I think that many practitioners would support such a thing, but you've got to get 160 states to support it. And that's a stretch. I mean, that's a stretch that we can see that happening.
But we have Ancestral Working Group 3 working very hard on and again, and this raises another question, which is that they have adopted a way of doing things which make me think very much of the way WTO worked in trade negotiations. Put a lot of things on the table to see and try to advance on everything and to see whether we can get some of these things done. And again, that's a tradition of WTO. It has not produced good results for WTO. What if we produce good results at Ancestral, we will see. But perhaps one question could be, should we not focus on one or two things? I mean, Ancestral has been very successful in getting through the transparency treaty, which is a very important document. So instead of negotiating on everything and trying to get to everything on the table, instead perhaps having a couple of focused objectives would perhaps be more effective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the UNCITRAL approach is good, and I do think the new exit rules have in fact addressed many of the issues, and these are systems that require us to continue to address reform, I think in a granular way that the various users and the various constituencies can really agree to. So, but thank you very much. You've done an incredible job. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Carolyn. I think, again, an incredible interview. You stepped in. I think you have a career for 60 minutes is your new career. Before I let you all leave to eat cake, I'm going to ask a favor. This is our second annual Investor State Conference. We want it to be the cornerstone for Miami Arbitration Week. We are in day 5 of inaugural Miami Arbitration Week, which has been pretty incredible for the participants. But we want to make it better. So if you've liked what you have seen here, if you could go to the app and give us some information. It's in the Miami 2024 room. Just tell us what you like, how we could do things. If there's things you think we could do better, how we could do those better. If there are debate topics for next year that you think we should be delving into, let us know. All right? And now you can eat cake.